Chapter 22 of Ravensdene Court by J.S. FLETCHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Red Dawn. I heard steps, soft as snowflakes, go along the deck above me. For an instant they paused by the open door at the head of my stairway. Then they went on again, and all was silent as before. But in that silence, above the gentle lapping of the water against the side of the yawl, I heard the furious thumping of my own heart, and I did not wonder at it, nor was I then, nor am I now ashamed of the fear that made it thump. Clearly, whatever else it might mean, if Baxter and the Frenchman were, as I surely believed them to be, soundly drugged, Miss Raven and I were at the positive mercy of a pack of Chinese adventurers who would probably stick at nothing. But my problem, one sufficient to rack every fibre of my brain, was, what were they after? The Chinese gentleman in the flamboyant pyjamas had without doubt repaired to his compatriots in the galley forward. At that moment they were, of course, holding some unholy conference. Were they going to murder Baxter and the Frenchman for the sake of the swag now safely on board? It was possible. I had heard many a tale far less so. No doubt the Supreme Spirit was a man of subtlety and craft. So, too, most likely was our friend Lo Chuh Fen. The other two would not be wanting. And if, of these other two, Wing, as Miss Raven had confidently surmised, and as I thought it possible, was one, then indeed there would be brains enough and to spare for the carrying out of any adventure. It seemed to me as I lay there, quaking and sweating in sheer fright, I, a defenceless, quiet, peace-loving gentleman of bookish tastes, who scarcely knew one end of a revolver from the other, that what was likely was that the Chinese were going to round on their English and French associates, collar the loot for themselves, and sail the yawl, heaven alone knew where. But in that case, what was going to become of me and my helpless companion? It was not likely that these Easterns would treat us with the consideration which we had received from the queer, eccentric, somewhat muddle-headed Netherfield Baxter, who, it struck me with odd inconsequence at that inopportune moment, was certainly a combination of Dick Turpin, Gil Blas, and Don Quixote. I suppose it was nearly an hour that passed. It may have been more, it may have been less. What I know is that it gave me some idea of what an accused man may feel who, waiting in a cell below, wonders what the foreman of a jury is going to say when he is called upstairs once more to the dock which he has vacated, pending that jury's deliberations. Once or twice I thought of daring everything, rousing Miss Raven, and attempting an escape by means of the boat which no doubt lay at the side of the yawl. But reflection suggested that so desperate a deed would only mean getting a bullet through me, and perhaps through her as well. Then I speculated on my chances of making a sinuous way along the deck on my hands and knees, or on my stomach, snake fashion, with the idea of listening at the hatch of the galley. Reflection again warned me that such an adventure would as likely as not end up with a few inches of cold steel in my side or through my gullet. So there I lay, sweating with fear, rapidly disintegrating as to nerve power, becoming a lump of moral rag and bone, and suddenly, unheralded by the slightest sound, I saw the figure of a man on my stairway, his outline silhouetted against the sky and the stars. It was not because of any bravery on my part, I'm sure of that, but through sheer fright that before I had the least idea of what I was doing, I had thrown myself clear of rugs and pillows, sprung to my feet, made one frenzied leap across the bit of intervening space, and clutched my intruder by his arms before his softly padded feet touched the floor of the cabin. My own breath was coming in gasps, but the response to my frenzy was quiet and cool as an autumnal afternoon. "Can you row a boat?" I shall never forget the mental douche which dashed itself over me in that clear yet scarcely perceptible whisper, accompanied as it was by a ghost-like laugh of sheer amusement. I released my grip, staring in the starlight at my visitor. Lo Chuh Fen. Yes, I answered, steadying my voice and keeping it down to as low tones as his own. Yes, I can. He pointed to the door behind which lay Miss Raven. Wait, missy, as quietly as possible, he whispered. Tell her get ready, come on deck, make no noise. All ready for you, then you go ashore and away, see? Not good for you to be here longer. No danger to her? I asked him. No danger to anybody, you do as I say, he answered. All ready for you, nothing to do but come on deck forward, get into the boat, be off, now. Without another word he glided up the stairway and disappeared. For a few seconds I stood irresolute. Was it a trick, a plant? Should we be safe on deck, or targets for Chinese bullets, or receptacles for Chinese knives? Yet I suddenly made up my mind. It was but one step to the door of the little inner cabin. I scraped on its panels. It opened instantly, a crack. Yes? Whispered Miss Raven. I remembered then that if need arose she was to do unquestioningly anything I told her to do. Dress at once and come out, I said. Be quick. I've never undressed, she answered. I lay down in my clothes. Then come just now, I commanded. Wait for nothing. She was out of the room at once and by my side in the gloom. I laid a hand on her arm, giving its plump softness a reassuring pressure. Don't be afraid, I whispered. Follow me on deck. We're going. Going, she said. Leaving? Come along, said I. I went before her up the stairway and out on the open deck. The night was particularly clear, the stars very bright. The patch of water between the yawl and the shore lay before us, calm and dark. We could see the woods above the cove quite plainly, and at the edge of them a ribbon of white, the silver sanded beach. And also, at the forward part of the vessel we were leaving, I saw, or fancied I saw, shadowy forms. The Chinese were going to see us off. But one form was not shadowy, nor problematical. Chuh was there, awaiting us, his arms filled with rugs. Without a word he motioned us to follow, preceded us along the side of the yawl to the boat, went before us into it, helped us down, settled us, put the oars into my hands, climbed out again and leaned his yellow face down at me. You pull straight ahead, he murmured. Good landing place, straight before you. Dry place on beach, too. Morning come soon. You get away then, through woods. The boat? I asked him. You leave boat there, anywhere, he answered. Boat not wanted again. We go, soon as high water over bar. Hope you get young missy safe home. Bless you, I said under my breath. Then, remembering that I had some money in my pocket, 3 or 4 loose sovereigns, as luck would have it, I thrust a hand therein, pulled them out, forced them into the man's claw-like fingers. I heard him chuckle softly, then his head disappeared behind the rail of the yawl, and I shoved the boat off and for the next few minutes bent to those oars as I had certainly never bent to any previous labour, mental or physical, in my life. And Miss Raven, seeing my earnestness, said nothing, but quietly took the tiller and steered us in a straight line for the spot which the Chinaman had indicated. Neither of us, strange as it may seem, spoke one single word until, at the end of half an hour's steady pull, the boat's nose ran onto the shingly beach, beneath a fringe of dwarf oak that came right down to the edge of the shore. I sprang out with a feeling of thankfulness that it would be hard to describe, and for a good reason found my tongue once more. Great Scott! I exclaimed. I've left my boots in that cabin. Despite the strange situation in which we were still placed, Miss Raven's sense of humour asserted itself. She laughed. Your boots, she said. Whatever will you do? These stones and the long walk home. There are things to be thought of before that, said I. We're still in the middle of the night. But this boat, do you think you can help me to drag it up the beach? Between us, the boat being a light one, we managed to pull it across the pebbles and under the low cliff beneath the overhanging fringe of the wood. In the uncertain light, for there was no moon, and since our setting out from the yawl masses of cloud had come up from the southeast to obscure the stars, the wood looked impenetrably black. "We shall have to wait here until the dawn comes," I remarked. "We can't find our way through the wood in this darkness. I can't even recollect the path, if there was one, by which they brought us down here from the ruins. You had better sit in the boat and make yourself comfortable with those rugs. Considerate of them, at any rate, to provide us with those." She got into the boat again, and I wrapped one rug round her knees and placed another about her shoulders. "And you?" she asked. "I must do a bit of amateur bootmaking," I answered. "I'm going to cut this third rug into strips and bind them about my feet. Can't walk over stones and thorns and thistles, to say nothing of the moorland track, without some protection." I got out my pocket knife, and sitting on the side of the boat began my task. For a few minutes she watched me in silence. "What does all this mean?" she said at last suddenly. "Why have they let us go?" "No idea," I answered. "But things have happened since Baxter said good night to us. Listen," and I went on to tell her of all that had taken place on the yawl since the return of the Frenchman and his Chinese companion. "What does it look like?" I concluded. "Doesn't it seem as if the Chinese intend foul play to those two?" "Do you mean that they intend to murder them?" she asked in a half frightened whisper. "Surely not that?" "I don't see that a man who has lived the life that Baxter has can expect anything but a violent end," I replied callously. "Yes, I suppose that's what they do mean. I think the Chinese mean to get rid of the two others and get away with the swag. Cleverly enough, no doubt." "Horrible!" she murmured. "Inevitable," said I. "To my mind the whole atmosphere was one of that sort of thing. We're most uncommonly lucky." She became silent again, and remained so for some time, while I went on at my task, binding the strips of rug about my feet and ankles, and fastening them, puttee fashion, around my legs. "I don't understand it!" she exclaimed, after several minutes had gone by. "Surely those men must know that we, once free of them, would be sure to give the alarm. We aren't under any promise to them, whatever we were to Baxter." "I don't understand anything," I said. "All I know is the surface of the situation. But that gentle villain who saw us off the yawl said that they were sailing at high water, only waiting until the tide was deep on the bar outside there. And they could get a long way, north or south or east, before we could set anybody on to them. Supposing they did get rid of Baxter and his Frenchman, what's to prevent them making off across the North Sea to, say, some port in the north of Russia? They've got stuff on board that would be saleable anywhere. No doubt they'll have it all melted into shapeless lumps before many hours are out." Once more she was silent, and when she spoke again it was in a note of decision. "No, I don't think that's it at all," she said emphatically. "They're dependent on wind and weather, and the seas aren't so wide, but that they'd be caught on our information. I'm sure that isn't it." "What is it, then?" I asked. "I've a sort of vague, misty idea," she answered, with a laugh that was plainly intended to be deprecatory of her own power. "Supposing these Chinese you say they're awfully keen and astute suppose they've got a plot amongst themselves for handing Baxter and the Frenchman over to the police, the authorities, with their plunder. Do you see it?" I had just finished the manufacture of my novel footwear, and I jumped to my padded feet with an exclamation that this time did not come from unpleasant contact with the sharp stones. "By George!" I said. "There is an idea in that. There may be something in it." "We thought Wing was on board," she continued. "If so, I think I may be right in offering such a suggestion. Supposing that Wing came across these people when he went to London, took service with them in the hope of getting at their secret. Suppose he's induced the other Chinese to secure Baxter and the Frenchman, that, in short, he's been playing the part of detective? Wouldn't that explain why they sent us away?" "Partly, yes, perhaps wholly," I said, struggling with this new idea. "But where and when and how do they intend, if your theory's correct, to do the handing over?" "That's surely easy enough," she replied quickly. "There's nothing to do but sail the yawl into, say, Berwick harbour, and call the police aboard. A very, very easy matter." "I wonder if it is so," I answered musingly. "It might be, but if we stay here until it's light and the tide's up we shall see which way the yawl goes." "It's high water between 5 and 6 o'clock," she remarked. "Anyway, it was between 4 and 5 yesterday morning at Ravensdene Court, which now seems to be far away in some other world." "Hungry?" I asked. "Not a bit," she answered. "But it's a long way since yesterday afternoon. We've seen things." "We've certainly seen Mr. Netherfield Baxter," I observed. "A fascinating man," she said with a laugh. "The sort of man, under other circumstances, one would like to have to dinner." Said I. "A ready and plausible tongue, to be sure. I dare say there are women who would fall in love with such a man." "Lots," she answered, with ready assent. "As I said just now, he's a very fascinating person." "Ah," said I teasingly, "I had a suspicion last night that he was exciting your sympathetic interest." "I'm much more sympathetic about your lack of boots and shoes," she retorted. "But as you seem to have rigged up some sort of satisfactory substitute, don't you think we might be making our way homewards? Is there any need to go through the woods? Why should we not follow the coast?" "I'm doubtful about our ability to get round the south point of this cove," I answered. "I was looking at it yesterday afternoon from the deck of the yawl, and I saw that just there a sort of wall of rock runs right out into the sea, and if the tide's coming in " "Then the woods," she interrupted. "Surely we can make our way through them somehow. And it will begin to get light in another hour or two." "But it's darker in there than you think for, and rougher going, too. However " Just then, and before she had made up her mind, we were both switched off that line of action by something that broke out on another. Across the 3/4 of a mile of water which separated us from our recent prison came the sound, clear and unmistakable, of a revolver shot, followed almost instantly by another. Miss Raven, who had risen to her feet, suddenly sat down again. A third shot rang out, a fourth, a fifth. We saw the flashes of each. They came without doubt from the deck of the yawl. "Firing!" she murmured. "Fighting," said I. "That's just listen to that." Half a dozen reports, sharp, insistent, rang out in quick succession, then 2 or 3, all mingling together, the echoes followed from wood and cliff. Rapidly as the flashes pierced the gloom, the sounds died out. A heavy silence followed. "That's just what?" asked Miss Raven calmly. "Well, if not just what I expected, it's at any rate partly what I expected," I said. "It had already struck me that if well, supposing whatever it was that the Chinaman dropped into those glasses didn't act quite as soporifically as he intended to, and Baxter and his companion woke up and found there was a conspiracy, a mutiny going on, there'd be a " "Fighting?" she suggested. "You're not a squeamish girl," I answered. "There'd be bloody murder. Their lives or the others, and I should say that death's stalking through that unholy craft just now." She made no answer, and we stood staring at the black bulk lying motionless on the grey water, stood for a time listening. I, to tell the truth, was straining my ears to catch the plash of oars. I thought it possible that some of those on board the yawl might take a violent desire to get ashore. But the silence continued. And now we said no more of setting out on our homeward journey. Curiosity as to what had happened kept us there, whispering. The time passed. Almost before we realized that night was passing, we were suddenly aware of a long line of faint yellow light that rose above the far horizon. "Dawn," I muttered. "Dawn." And then, at that moment, we both heard something. Somewhere outside the bar, but close to the shore, a steam-propelled vessel was tearing along at a breakneck speed. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23, A Ravensdene Court, by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fourth Chinaman. As we stood there watching, the long line of yellow light on the eastern horizon suddenly changed in colour, first to a roseate flush, then to a warm crimson. The scenes around us, sky, sea, and land, brightened as if by magic. And with equal suddenness there shot round the edge of the southern extremity of the cove, outlining itself against the red sky in the distance, the long, low-lying hulk of a vessel, a dark, sinister-looking thing, which I recognized at once as a torpedo destroyer. It was coming along about half a mile outside the bar, at a rare turn of speed, which would, I knew, quickly carry it beyond our field of vision. And I was wondering whether, from its decks, the inside of the cove and the yawl lying at anchor there was visible when it suddenly slackened in its headlong career, went about seaward, and describing the greater part of a circle, came slowly in towards the bar, nosing about there beyond the line of white surf, for all the world like a terrier at the lip of some rat-hole. Up to that moment Miss Raven and I had kept silence, watching this unexpected arrival in our solitude. Now, turning to look at her, I saw that the thought which had come into my mind had also occurred to hers. "Do you think that ship is looking for the yawl?" she asked. "It's a gunboat, or something of that sort, isn't it?" "Torpedo destroyer, latest class, too," I answered. "Rakish, wicked-looking things, aren't they? And that's just what I, too, was wondering. It's possible some news of the yawl may have got to the ears of the authorities, and this thing may have been sent from the nearest base to take a look along the coast. Perhaps they've spotted the yawl, but they can't get over that bar yet." "The tide's rising fast, though," she remarked, pointing to the shore immediately before us. "It'll be up to this boat soon." I saw that she was right, and that presently the boat would be floating. We made it fast and retreated further up the beach, amongst the overhanging trees, and there, from beneath the shelter of a group of dwarf oaks, looked seaward again. The destroyer lay supine outside the bar, watching. Suddenly, right behind her, far across the grey sea, the sun shot up above the horizon. Her long dark hull cut across his ruddy face, and we were then able to make out shapes that moved here and there on her deck. There were live men there, but on the yawl we saw no sign of life. Yet even as we looked, life sprang up there again. Once more a shot rang out, followed by two others in sharp succession. And as we stared in that direction, wondering what this new affray could be, we saw a boat shoot out from beneath the bows with a low, crouching figure in it, which was evidently making frantic efforts to get away. Somebody on board the yawl was just as eager to prevent this escape. 3 or 4 shots sounded. Following one of them, the figure in the boat fell forward with a sickening suddenness. "Got him!" I said involuntarily. "Poor devil, whoever he is!" "No!" exclaimed Miss Raven. "See, he's up again." The figure was struggling to an erect position. Even at that distance we could make out the effort. But the light of the newly risen sun was so dazzling and confusing that we could not tell if the figure was that of an Englishman or a Chinaman. It was, at any rate, the figure of a tall man. And whoever he was, he managed to rise to his feet and to lift an arm in the direction of the yawl, from which he was then some 20 yards away. 2 more shots rang out, one from the yawl, another from the boat. It seemed to me that the man in the boat swayed, but a moment later he was again busy at his oars. No further shot came from the yawl, and the boat drew further and further away from it, in the direction of a spit of land some 300 or 400 yards from where we stood. There were high rocks at the sea end of that spit. The boat disappeared behind them. "There's one villain loose, at any rate," I muttered. not too well pleased to think that he was within reach of ourselves. "I wonder which. But I'm sure he was winged. He fell in a heap, didn't he, at one of those shots? Of course he'll take to the woods, and we've got to get through them." "Not yet," said Miss Raven. "Look here." She pointed across the cove and beyond the bar, and I saw then that a boat had been put off from the destroyer and was being pulled at a rapid rate towards the line of surf, which under the deepening tide was now but a thin streak of white. It seemed to me that I could see the glint of arms above the flash of the oars. Anyway, there was a boat's crew of blue jackets there. "They're going to board her!" I exclaimed. "I wonder what they'll find?" "Dead men," answered Miss Raven quietly. "What else? After all that shooting? I should think that man who's just got away was the last." "There was a man left on board who fired at him, and at whom he fired back," I pointed. "Yes, and who never fired again," she retorted. "They must all oh!" She interrupted herself with a sharp exclamation, and turning back from watching the blue jackets and their boat, I saw that she was staring at the yawl. From its forecastle a black column of smoke suddenly shot up, followed by a great lick of flame. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "The yawl's on fire!" I guessed then at what had probably happened. The man who had just disappeared with his boat behind the spit of land further along the cove had in all likelihood been one of the two survivors of the fight which had taken place in the early hours of the morning. He had wished to get away by himself, had set fire to the yawl, and sneaked away in the only boat, exchanging shots with the man left behind, and probably killing him with the last one. And now there was smoke and flame above what was doubtless a shambles. But by that time the boat's crew from the destroyer had crossed the bar and entered the cove, and the vigorously impelled oars were flashing fast in the sheltered waters. The boat disappeared behind the drifting smoke that poured out of the yawl. Presently we saw figures hurrying hither and thither about her deck. "They may be in time to get the fire under," I said. "Better, perhaps, if they let the whole thing burn itself out. It would burn up a lot of villainy." "Here are people coming along the beach," remarked Miss Raven suddenly. "Look! They must have seen the smoke rising." I turned in the direction in which she was looking, and saw, on the strip of land and pebble beneath the woods, a group of figures, standing at that moment and staring in the direction of the burning ship, which had evidently just rounded the extreme point of the cove at its southern confines. There were several figures in the group, and two were mounted. Presently these moved forward in our direction at a smart pace. Before they had gone far, I recognized the riders. "A search party!" I exclaimed. "Look! That's Mr. Raven in front, and surely that's Lorrimore behind him. They're looking for us." She gazed at the approaching figures for a moment, shielding her eyes from the already strong glare of the mounting sun, then ran forward along the shingle to meet them. I followed as rapidly as my improvised footwear would permit. By the time I reached them, Mr. Raven and Lorrimore were off their horses, the other members of the party had come up, and my companion in tribulation was explaining the situation. I let her talk. She was summing it all up in more concise fashion than I could have done. Her uncle listened with simple, open-mouthed astonishment. Lorrimore, when it came to mention of the Chinese element, with an obvious growing concern that seemed to be not far away from suspicion. He turned to me as Miss Raven finished. "How many Chinese do you reckon were on board?" he asked. "4, including the last arrival, described as a gentleman," I answered. "And 2 English?" he inquired. "1 Englishman and 1 Frenchman," said I. "My belief is that the Chinese have settled the other 2, and then possibly settled themselves among them. There's one man somewhere in these woods. Whether he's a Chinaman we can't say, we couldn't make out." He stared at me wonderingly for a moment, then turned and looked at the yawl. Evidently the blue jackets had succeeded in checking the fire. The flame had died down, and the smoke now only hung about in wreaths. We could see figures running actively about the deck. "There may be men on there that need medical assistance," said Lorrimore. "Where's this boat you mentioned, Middlebrook? I'm going off to that vessel. Two of you men pull me across there." "I'll go with you," said I. "I left my boots in the cabin. I may find them. And a good deal else. The boat's just along here." The search party was a mixed lot a couple of local policemen, some gamekeepers, 2 or 3 fishermen, one of Mr. Raven's men servants. 2 of the fishermen ran the boat into the water. Lorrimore and I sprang in. "This is the most extraordinary affair I ever heard of," he said, as he sat down at my side in the stern. "Miss Raven says that you actually suspected my man Wing to be on board." "Lorrimore," said I, "in 10 minutes you'll probably see and learn things that you'd never have dreamed of. Whether your man Wing is on board or not, I don't know, but I know that that girl and I have had a marvellous escape from a nest of human devils. I can't say for myself, but has my hair whitened?" "Your hair hasn't whitened," he said. "You were probably safer than you knew safe enough, if Wing was there." "Well, I don't know," I retorted. "In future, let me avoid the sight of yellow cheeks and slit eyes. I've had enough. But tell me, how did you and your posse come this way? Didn't Mr. Raven get a wire last night?" "Mr. Raven did get a wire," he replied. "But before he got it, he'd become anxious, and had sent out some of his menfolk along the moors and cliffs in search of you. One of them, very late in the evening, came across a man who had been cutting wood somewhere hereabouts, and had seen you and Miss Raven passing through the woods near the shore in company with 2 strangers. Mr. Raven's man returned close on midnight with this news, and the old gentleman was of course thrown into a great state of alarm. He roused the whole community round Ravensdene Court, got me up, and we set out, as you see. But the whole thing's marvellous! I can't help thinking that Wing may have been on board this vessel, and that it was due to him you got away." "You've heard nothing of him from London?" I suggested. "Nothing from anywhere," he replied. "Which is precisely why I feel sure that when he went there he came in contact with these people, and has been playing some deep game." "Deep, yes," said I. "Deep indeed. But what game?" He made no answer. We were now close to the yawl, and he was staring expectantly at the figures on her deck. Suddenly 2 of these detached themselves from the rest, turned, came to the side, looked down on us. One was a grimy-faced, alert-looking young naval officer, very much alive to his job. The other, not quite so smoke-blackened, but eminently businesslike, was Scarterfield. "Good heavens!" I muttered. "So he's here!" Scarterfield, as we pulled up to the side of the yawl, was evidently telling the young officer who we were. He turned from him to us as we prepared to clamber aboard, and addressed us without ceremony, as if we had been parted from him but a few minutes since our last meeting. "You'd better be prepared for some unpleasant sights, you 2," he said. "This is no place to bring an empty stomach to at this hour of the morning. And I fancy you've no liking for horrors, Mr. Middlebrook." "I've had plenty of them during this night, Scarterfield," said I. "I was a prisoner on board this vessel from yesterday afternoon until soon after midnight, and I've sat on yonder beach listening to a good many things that have gone on since I got away from her." He stared at me in astonishment for a moment. So did his companion, whose sharp eyes, running me over, settled their glance on my swathed feet. "Yes," I said, staring back at him. "Just so. I was bundled off in such a hurry that I left my boots behind me. They're in the cabin, and if they aren't burned up, I'll be glad of them." I was making a move in that direction, for I saw that the fire, now well under control, had been confined to the forepart of the yawl, but Scarterfield stopped me. He was clearly as puzzled as anxious. "Middlebrook," he said earnestly, "I don't understand it at all. You say you were on this vessel during the night? Then in God's name, who else was on her? Whom did you find here? What men?" "I left 6 men on her," I answered. "Netherfield Baxter, a Frenchman, a Chinese gentleman, so described, 3 Chinese as well. The Frenchman and the Chinese gentleman were those fellows we heard of at Hull, Scarterfield, and one, at any rate, of the other three Chinese was Lo Chuh Fen, of whom we've also heard." "And you got into their hands? How?" he asked. "Kidnapped, Miss Raven and myself, by Baxter and the Frenchman, in those woods, yesterday afternoon," I answered. "We came across them by accident, at the place where they'd just dug up that monastic silver. There it is, man," I continued, pointing to the chests, which still stood where I had last seen them. "You've got it at last." He threw an almost careless glance at the chests, shaking his head. "I want something beyond that," he muttered. "But you say there were 6 men altogether? 6?" "I've enumerated them," I replied. 2 Europeans, 4 Chinese." He turned a quick eye on the naval officer. "Then one of 'em's escaped, somehow!" he exclaimed. "There's only 5 here, and every man Jack is dead. Where's the other?" "One did escape," said I. I, too, looked at the lieutenant. "He got off in a boat just as you and your men were approaching the bar yonder. I thought you'd see him." "No," he answered, shaking his head. "We didn't see anybody leave. The yawl lay between us and him, most likely. Where did he land?" "Behind that spit," I replied, pointing to the place. "He vanished from where I stood, behind those black rocks. That was just as you crossed the bar. And he can't have gone far away, for he was certainly wounded as he left the yawl. A man fired at him from the bows. He fired back." "We heard those shots," said the lieutenant, "and we found a chap, Englishman, in the bows, dying, when we boarded her. He died just afterwards. They're all dead. The others were dead then." "Not a man alive!" I exclaimed. Scarterfield cast a glance astern, the glance of a man who draws back the curtain from a set stage. "Look for yourselves," he muttered. "Too late for any of your work, doctor. But that 6th man?" Lorrimore and I, giving no heed just then to the detective's questioning about the escaped man, went towards the after part of the deck. Busied with their labours in getting the fire under control, the blue jackets had up to then left the dead men where they found them, with one exception. The man whom they had found in the bows had been carried aft and laid near the entrance to the little deck house. Some hand had thrown a sheet over him. Lorrimore lifted it. We looked down. Baxter. "That's the fellow we found right forward," said the lieutenant. "He's several slighter wounds on him, but he'd been shot through the chest heart, perhaps just before we boarded her. That would be the shot fired by the man in the boat, I suppose. A good marksman. Was this the skipper?" "Chief spirit," said I. "He was lively enough last night. But the rest?" "They're all over the place," he answered. "They must have had a most desperate do of it. The vessel's more like a slaughter-house than a ship." He was right there, and I was thankful that Miss Raven and I, for whatever reason on the part of the Chinese, had been so unceremoniously sent ashore before the fight began. As Lorrimore went about, noting its evidence, I endeavoured to form some idea, more or less accurate, of the events which had led up to it. It seemed to me that either Baxter or the Frenchman, awaking from sleep sooner than the Chinese had expected, had discovered that treachery was afoot and that wholesale shooting had begun on all sides. Most of the slaughter had taken place immediately in front of the hatchway which led to the cabin in which I had seen Baxter and his 2 principal associates. Some sort of a rough barricade had been hastily set up there. Behind it the Frenchman lay dead with a bullet through his brain. Before it, here and there on the deck, lay 3 of the Chinese, their leader, still in his gaily coloured sleeping suit, prominent amongst them, Lo Chuh Fen a little further away, the 3rd man near the wheel, face downwards. He, like Chuh, was a small-made, wiry fellow, and there was blood everywhere. Scarterfield jogged my elbow as I stood staring at these unholy sights. He was keener of look than I had ever seen him. "That Fourth Chinaman," he said. "I must get him, dead or alive. The rest's nothing. I want him." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Ravensdene Court by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Silk Cap. I glanced round. Lorrimore, after an inspection of the dead men, had walked aside with the lieutenant and was in close conversation with him. I, too, drew the detective away to the side of the yawl. "Scarterfield," I said in a whisper, "I've grounds for believing that the Fourth Chinaman is Lorrimore's servant, Wing." "The man we saw at Ravensdene Court?" "Just so," said I, "and who went off to London, you remember, to see what he could do in the way of discovering the other Chinaman, Lo Chuh Fen." "Yes, I remember that," he answered. "There is Lo Chuh Fen," I said, pointing to one of the silent figures. "And I think that Wing not only discovered him, but came aboard this vessel with him, as part of a crew which Baxter and his French friend got together at Limehouse or Poplar. As I say, I've grounds for thinking it." Scarterfield looked round, glanced at the shore, and shook his head. "I'm all in the dark about some things," he said. "I got on the track of this craft I'll tell you how later and found she'd come up this coast, and we got the authorities to send this destroyer after her. Came with her, hell for leather, I can tell you, from Harwich. But I don't know a lot that I want to know. Baxter, now, you're sure that man lying dead there is the Baxter we heard of at Blyth and traced to Hull?" "Certain," said I. "Listen, and I'll give you a brief account of what's happened since yesterday, and of what I've learned since then, and it will make things clear to you." Standing there, where the beauty of the fresh morning and the charm of sky and sea made a striking contrast to the horror of our immediate surroundings, I told him, as concisely as I could, of how Miss Raven and myself had fallen into the hands of Netherfield Baxter and the Frenchman, of what had happened to me on board, and, at somewhat greater length, of Baxter's story of his own career as it related to his share in the theft of the monastic treasure from the bank at Blyth, his connection with the Elizabeth Robinson, and his knowledge of the brothers Quick. Nor did I forget Baxter's theory about the rubies, and at that Scarterfield obviously pricked his ears. "Now, there's something in that," he said, with a regretful glance at the place where Baxter's dead body lay under its sheet. "I wish that fellow had been alive to tell more, for he's right about those rubies, quite right. The Quicks had 'em, 2 of 'em." "You know that?" I exclaimed. "I'll tell you," he answered. "After we parted, I was very busy, investigating matters still further in Devonport and in London, and, through the newspapers, of course, I got in touch with a man who told me a lot. He came to headquarters in London, asking for me. Wouldn't tell any of our people there anything. It was a day or two before I got at close quarters with him, for when he called I was away at the time. He left an address in Hatton Gardens, a Mr. Isidore Baubenheimer, dealer, as you may conclude, in precious stones. Well, I drove off at once to see him. He told me a queer tale. He said that he'd only just come back from Amsterdam and Paris, or he'd have been in communication with me earlier. While he'd been away, he said, he'd read the English newspapers and seen a good deal about the 2 murders at Saltash and Ravensdene Court, and he believed that he could throw some light on them, for he felt sure that either Noah Quick or Salter Quick was identical with the man with whom he had not so long ago talked over the question of the value of certain stones which the man possessed. But I'll show you Baubenheimer's own words. I got him to make a clear statement of the whole thing, and had it taken down in black and white, and I have a typed copy of it in my pocket-book. Glance over it for yourself." He produced a sheet of paper, folded and endorsed, and handed to me. It ran thus: "My place of business in Hatton Garden is a few doors away from the Hatton Garden entrance to the old Mitre Tavern, which lies between that street and Ely Place. On, as far as I can remember, the 7th or 8th of March last, I went into the Mitre about 11:30 one morning, expecting to meet a friend of mine who was often there about that time. He hadn't come in. I sat down with a drink and a cigar to wait for him. In the little room where I sat there were 3 other men. 2 of them were men that I knew, men who dealt in diamonds in a smallish way. The other was a stranger, a thick-set, middle-aged, seafaring sort of man, hard-bitten, dressed in a blue serge suit of nautical cut. I could tell from his hands and his general appearance that he'd knocked about the world in his time. Just then he was smoking a cigar and had a tumbler of rum and water before him, and he was watching, with a good deal of interest, the other 2, who, close by, were showing each other a quantity of loose diamonds which, evidently to the seafaring man's amazement, they spread out openly on their palms. After a bit they got up and went out, and the stranger glanced at me. Now I am, as you see, something of the nautical sort myself, bearded and bronzed and all that. I'm continually crossing the North Sea, and it may be he thought I was of his own occupation. Anyway, he looked at me as if wanting to talk. "I reckon they think nothing of pulling out a fistful of them things hereabouts, mister," he said. "No more to them than sovereigns and half-sovereigns and bank-notes is to bank clerks." "That's about it," said I. "You'll see them shown in the open street outside." "Trade of this part of London, isn't it?" he asked. "Just so," said I. "I'm in it myself." He gave me a sharp, inquiring look at that. "Ah!" he remarked. "Then you'll be a gentleman as knows the vally of a thing of that sort when you sees it?" "Well, I think so," I answered. "I've been in the trade all my life. Have you got anything to dispose of? I see you're a seafaring man, and I've known sailors who brought something nice home now and then." "Same here," said he, "but I never known a man as brought anything half as good as what I have." "Ah!" said I. "Then you have something?" "That's what I come into this here neighbourhood for this morning," he answered. "I have something, and a friend of mine, says he to me, 'Hatton Garden,' he says, 'is the port for you. They eats and drinks and wallers and them sort of things down that way,' he says. So I steers for this here, only I don't know no fish, d'ye see, as I could put the question to what I wants to ask." "Put it to me," said I, drawing out my card case. "There's my card, and you can ask anybody within half a square mile if they don't know me for a trustworthy man. What is it you've got?" I went on, never dreaming that he'd got anything at all of great value. "I'll give you an idea of its worth in 2 minutes." But he glanced round at the door and shook his head. "Not here, mister," he said. "I wouldn't let the light o' day shine on what I got in a public place like this, not nohow. But," he added, "I see you have a office and all that. I ain't undisposed to go there with you, if you like. You seem an honest man." "Come on, then," I said. "My office is just round the corner, and though I've clerks in it, we'll be private enough there." "Right you are, mister," he answered, and he drank off his rum, and we went out and round to my office. I took him into my private room. I had a young lady clerk in there, she'd remember this man well enough, and he looked at her and then at me. "Send the girl away," he muttered. "There's a matter of undressing, d'ye see, in getting at what I want to show you." I sent her out of the room and sat down at my desk. He took off his overcoat, his coat, and his waistcoat, shoved his hand into some secret receptacle that seemed to be hidden in the band of his trousers, somewhere behind the small of his back, and after some acrobatic contortions and twistings, lugged out a sort of canvas parcel, the folds of which he unwrapped leisurely. And suddenly, coming close to me, he laid the canvas down on my blotting pad, and I found myself staring at some dozen or so of the most magnificent pearls I had ever set eyes on, and a couple of rubies which I knew to be priceless. I was never more astonished in my life, but he was cool as a cucumber. "What d'ye think of that lot, mister?" he asked. "I reckon you don't see a little lot of that quality every day." "No, my friend," said I, "nor every year either, nor every 10 years. Where on earth did you get them?" "Away East," said he, and I've had 'em some time, not being particular about selling 'em, but I've settled down in England now, and I think I will sell 'em and buy house property with the money. What do you fix their valley at now, mister? Thereabouts, anyway." "Good heavens, man!" I said. "They're worth a great deal of money a great deal." "I'm very well aware o' that, mister," he answered. "Very well aware indeed nobody better. I seen a deal o' things in my time, and I ain't no fool." "You really want to sell them?" I asked. "If I get the full price," said he. "And that, of course, would be a big 'un." "The thing to do," I said, "would be to find somebody who wants to complete a particularly fine set of pearls some very rich woman who'd stick at nothing. The same remark applies to the rubies." "Maybe you could come across some customer?" he suggested. "No doubt in a little time," I answered. "Well," he said, "I'm going up north. I've a bit o' business that way, and I reckon I'll be back here in London in a week or so. I'll call in then, mister, and if you've found anybody that's likely to deal, I'll show 'em the goods with pleasure." "You'd better leave them with me, and let me show them to some possible buyers," I said. But he was already folding up his canvas wrapping again. "Guv'nor," he answered, "I can see as how you're an honest man, and I treats you as such, and so will, but I couldn't have them things out o' my possession for 1 minute until I sells 'em. I've a brother, mister," he added, "as owns half a share in 'em, d'ye see, and I holds myself responsible to him. But now that you've seen 'em, guv'nor, find a buyer, or buyers. I'll shove my bows round that door o' yours again this day week." And with that he restored his treasures to their hiding place, assumed his garments once more, and remarking that he had a train to catch, hastened off, again assuring me that he would call in a week on his return from the north. I folded up the statement and restored it to Scarterfield. "What do you think of that?" he asked. "Salter Quick, without a doubt," I answered. "It corroborates Baxter's story of the rubies. He didn't mention any pearls. And I think now, Scarterfield, that Salter Quick's murder lies at the door of one of those Chinamen who in their turn are lying dead before us." "Well, and that's what I think," said he. "Though however a Chinaman could be about this coast without the local police learning something of it at the time they were inquiring into the murder beats me. However, there it is. I feel sure of it. And I was going to tell you I got wind of this yawl down Limehouse way. I found out that she'd been in the Thames, and that her owner had enlisted a small crew of Chinamen and had gone away with them, and I found out further that she'd been seen off the Norfolk coast going north. So then I pitched a hot and strong story to the authorities about piracy and all manner of things, and they sent this destroyer in search of Baxter and me on her. If we'd only been 12 hours sooner." Lorrimore and the lieutenant came up to us. "My men have the fire completely beaten," said the lieutenant, glancing at Scarterfield. "If you want to look around." We began a thorough examination of the yawl, in the endeavour to reconstruct the affair of the early morning. For there were all the elements of a strange mystery in that, and curiosity about the whole thing was as strong in me as in Scarterfield. We knew now many things that we had not known 24 hours before. One was that the many affairs, dark and nefarious, of Netherfield Baxter had nothing to do with the murders of Noah and Salter Quick. Another that those murders without doubt arose from the brother's possession of the pearls and rubies which Salter had shown to the Hatton Garden diamond merchant. All things considered, it seemed to me that the explanation of the mystery rested in some such theory as this. The Chinaman, Lo Chuh Fen, doubtless knew as well as Baxter and his French friend that the Quicks were in possession of the rubies stolen from the heathen temple in southern China. No doubt he had become acquainted with that fact when the marooned party from the Elizabeth Robinson were on the intimate terms of men united by a common fate on the lonely island. Drifting eventually to England, Chuh had probably discovered the whereabouts of the two brothers, had somehow found that the rubies were still in their possession, might possibly have been in personal touch with Salter or with Noah, had taken others of his compatriots, discovered in the Chinese quarters of the East End, into his confidence, and engineered a secret conspiracy for securing the valuables. He himself had probably tracked Salter to the lonely bit of shore near Ravensdene Court. Associates of his had no doubt fallen upon Noah at Saltash. But how had all this led up to the attack of the Chinese on Baxter and the Frenchman? And who was the man who, leaving every other member of the yawl's company dead or dying, and who had exchanged those last shots with Netherfield Baxter, had escaped to the shore and was now, no doubt, endeavouring to make a final bid for liberty? Reckoning up everything we saw, it seemed to me, from my knowledge of the preceding incidents, that the drug which the Chinese gentleman, as Baxter had been pleased to style him, had not had the effects that he desired and anticipated, and that one or the other of the two men to whom it had been administered had been aroused from sleep before any attack could be made on both. I figured things in this way: Baxter, or the Frenchman, or both, had awakened and missed the Chinaman. One or both had turned out to seek him, had discovered that Miss Raven and I were missing, had scented danger to themselves, found the Chinese up to some game, and opened fire on them. Evidently the first fighting, as I had gathered from the revolver shots, had been sharp and decisive. I formed the conclusion that when it was over there were only two men left alive, of whom one was Baxter and the other the man whom we had seen escaping in the boat. Baxter, I believed, had put up some sort of barricade and watched his enemy from it. That he himself was already seriously wounded I gathered from two facts: one, that his body had several superficial wounds on arms and shoulders, and that in the cabin behind the hastily constructed barricade sheets had been torn into strips for bandages, which we found on these wounds, where, as far as he could, he had roughly twisted them. Then, according to my thinking, he had eventually seen the other survivor, who was probably in like case with himself as regards superficial wounds, endeavouring to make off, and emerging from his shelter had fired on him from the side of the yawl, only to be killed himself by return fire. There was no mistaking the effect of that last shot. Chance shot or well-directed aim, it had done for Netherfield Baxter, and he had crumpled up and died where he dropped. A significant exclamation from Scarterfield called me to his side. He, aided by one of the blue jackets, was examining the body of Lo Chuh Fen. "Look here," he murmured as I went up to him. "This chap has been searched. After he was dead, I mean. There's a body belt that he wore. It's been violently torn from him, his clothing ripped to get at it, and the belt itself hacked to pieces in the endeavour to find something. Whose work has that been?" "The work of the man who got away in the boat," said I. "Of course! He's been after those rubies and pearls, Scarterfield." "We must be after him," he said. "You say you think he was wounded in getting away?" "He was certainly wounded," I affirmed. "I saw him fall headlong in the boat after the first shot. He recovered himself, fired the shot which no doubt finished Baxter, and must have been wounded again, for the two men again fired simultaneously, and the man in the boat swayed at that second shot. But once more he pulled himself together and rowed away." "Well, if he's wounded he can't get far without attracting notice," declared Scarterfield. "We'll organize a search for him presently. But first, let's have a look into the quarters that these Chinamen occupied." The smoke of the fire, which seemed to have broken out in the forecastle, and had been confined to it by the efforts of the sailors from the destroyer, had now almost cleared away, and we went forward to the galley. The fire had not spread to that, and after the scenes of blood and violence astern and in the cabin, the place looked refreshingly spick and span. There was, indeed, an unusual air of neatness and cleanliness about it. The various pots and pans shone gaily in the sun's glittering lights. Every utensil was in its place. Evidently the galley's controlling spirit had been a meticulously careful person, who hated disorder as heartily as dirt. And, on a shelf near the stove, was laid out what I took to be the things which the vanished cook, whoever he might be, had destined for breakfast: a tempting one of kidneys and bacon, soles, eggs, a curry. I gathered from this, and pointed my conclusion out to Scarterfield, that the presiding genius of the galley had had no idea of the mutiny into which he had been plunged soon after midnight. "Aye," said Scarterfield, "just so. I see your point. And you think that man of Lorrimer's, Wing, was aboard, and if so, he's the man who escaped?" "I've strong suspicions," said I. "Yet they were based on a plum cake." "Well, and I've known of worse clues," he rejoined. "But I wonder. Now, if only we knew " Just then Lorrimore came along, poking his head into the galley. He suddenly uttered a sharp exclamation, and reached an arm to a black silk cap which hung from a peg on the boarding above. "That's Wing's," he said in emphatic tones. "I saw him make that cap himself." Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Ravensdene Court by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Clear decks. The bit of headgear which Lorrimore had taken down assumed a new interest. Scarterfield and I gazed at it as if it might speak to us. Nevertheless, the detective, when he presently spoke, showed some incredulity. "That's the sort of cap that any Chinaman wears," he remarked. "It may have belonged to any of them." "No," answered Lorrimore, with emphatic assurance. "That's my man's. I saw him making it. He's as deft with his fingers at that sort of thing as he is at cooking. And since this cap is his, and as he's not among the lot there on deck, he's the man that you, Middlebrook, saw escaping in the boat, and since he is that man, I know where he'd be making." "Where, then?" demanded Scarterfield. "To my house," answered Lorrimore. Scarterfield showed more doubt. "I don't think that's likely, Doctor," he said. "Presumably he's got those jewels on him, and I should say he'd get away from this with the notion of trusting to his own craft to get unobserved on a train and lose himself in Newcastle. A Chinaman with valuables on him worth £80,000? Come!" "You don't know that he's any valuables of any sort on him," retorted Lorrimore. "That's all supposition. I say that if my man Wing was on this vessel, as I'm sure he was on it for purposes of his own. He might be with this felonious lot, but he wouldn't be of them. I know him, and I'm off to get on his track. Lay you anything you like, 1,000 to 1, that I find Wing at my house." "I'm not taking you, Lorrimore," said I. "I don't mind laying the same." Scarterfield looked curiously at the two of us. Apparently his belief in Chinese virtue was not great. "Well," he said, "I'm on his track anyhow, and I propose to get away to the beach. There's nothing more we can do here. These naval people have got this job in charge now. Let's leave them to it. Yet," he added, as we left the galley, and with a significant glance at me, "there is one thing, Middlebrook. Wouldn't you like to have a look inside those two chests that we've heard so much about, you and I?" "I certainly should," I answered. "Then we will," he said. "I, too, have some curiosity that way. And if Master Wing has repaired to the doctor's house, he's all right, and if he hasn't, he can't get very far away, being a Chinaman in his native garments and wounded." The chests which had come aboard the yawl with Miss Raven and myself the previous afternoon, it seemed as if ages had gone by since then, still stood where they had been placed at the time, close to the gangway leading to the main cabin. Lorrimore, Scarterfield, the young naval officer, and I gathered round, while a couple of handy bluejackets forced them open. No easy business, for whether the dishonest bank manager and Netherfield Baxter had ever opened them or not, they were screwed up again in a fashion which showed business-like resolves that they should not be easily opened again. But at last the lids were off, to reveal inner shells of lead, and within these, gleaming dully in the fresh sunlight, lay the monastic treasures of which Scarterfield and I had read in the hotel at Blyth. "Queer," said the detective, as he stood staring meditatively at patens and chalices, reliquaries and pyxes. "All these, I reckon, are sacred things, consecrated and all that, and yet ever since the Reformation time they've been mixed up with robbery, and now at last with wholesale murder. Odd, isn't it? However, there they are. And here," he added, pulling the parchment schedules out of his pocket, which he had discovered at Baxter's old lodgings in Blyth, and handing them to the lieutenant, "here is the list of what ought to be. You'll take all this in charge, of course. I don't know if it comes within the law of treasure trove or not, but as the original owners are dust and ashes 400 years ago, I should say it does. Anyway, the Crown solicitors will soon settle that point." We went off from the yawl, the three of us, in the boat which had brought Lorrimore and me aboard her. The group on shore saw us making for the point whereat the escaping figure had landed in the early morning, and followed us thither along the beach. They came up to us as we stepped ashore, and while Lorrimore began giving Mr. Raven an account of what we had found on the yawl, I drew his niece aside. "You had better know the worst in a word," I said. "We were more than fortunate in getting away from the yawl as we did. Don't be upset. There isn't a man alive on that thing." "Baxter?" she exclaimed. "I said not one," I answered. "Wholesale. Don't think about it. As for me, I wish I'd never seen it. But now it's a question of a living man. Wing." "Then it was as I thought?" she asked. "Wing was there?" "Lorrimore is sure of it. He found a cap of Wing's in the galley," said I. "And as Wing isn't amongst the dead, he's the man who escaped." Scarterfield came up, the local policeman with him who had joined Mr. Raven's search party as it came across country. "Whereabouts did this man land, Middlebrook?" he asked. "You saw him, you and Miss Raven, didn't you?" "We saw him round these rocks," I replied. "But then they hid him from us. We couldn't see exactly. Somewhere on the other side of them, anyway." We spread ourselves out along the shore, crossing the spit of sand, now encroached on considerably by the tide, and began to search amongst the black rocks that jutted out of it thereabouts. Presently we came across the boat, slightly rocking in the lapping water alongside a ledge. I took a hasty glance into it and drew Miss Raven away. For on the thwarts, and on the seat in the stern, and on one of the oars, thrown carelessly aside, there was blood. A sharp cry from one of the men who had gone a little ahead brought us all hurrying to his side. He had found, amongst the rocks, a sort of pool at the sides of which there was dry, sand-strewn rock. There were marks there, as if a man had knelt in the sand, and there was more blood, and there were strips of clothing, linen, silk, as if the man had torn up some of his garments as temporary bandages. "He's been here," said Lorrimore in a low voice. "Probably washed his wounds here. Salt is a styptic. Flesh wounds, most likely, but," he added, sinking his voice still lower, "judging from what we've seen of the blood he's lost, he must have been weakening by the time he got here. Still, he's a man of vast strength and physique, and he'd push on. Look for marks of his footsteps." We eventually picked up a recently made track in the sand, and followed it until it came to a point at the end of the overhanging woods, where they merged into the open moorland running steeply down towards the beach. There, in the short, wiry grass of the close-knitted turf, the marks vanished. "Just as I said," muttered Lorrimore, whom, with Miss Raven and myself, was striding on a little in advance of the rest. "He's made for my place, as I knew he would. I knew enough of this country to know that there's a road at the head of these moors that runs parallel with the railway on one side and the coast on the other towards Ravensdene. He'd be making for that. He'd take up the side of this wood as the nearest way to strike the road." That he was right in this we were not long in finding out. Twice, as our party climbed the steep side of the moorland, we came across evidence of the fugitive. At 2 points we found places whereat a man had recently sat down on the bank beneath the trees to rest. And at one of them we found more, a blood-soaked bandage. "No man can go far losing blood in that way," whispered Lorrimore to me, as we went onward. "He can't be far off." And suddenly we came across our quarry. Coming out on the top of the moorland, and rounding the corner of the woods, we hit the road of which Lorrimore had spoken, a long, white, hedgeless, wall-less ribbon of track that ran north and south through treeless country. There, a few yards away from us, stood an isolated cottage, some gamekeeper's or watcher's place, with a bit of unfenced garden before it. In that garden was a strange group, gathered about something that at first we did not see. Mr. Cazalet, obviously very busy, the police inspector, a horse and trap tethered to a post close by showed how they had come, a woman, evidently the mistress of the cottage, a child, open-mouthed, wide-eyed with astonishment at these strange happenings, a dog that moved uneasily around the two-legged folk, whimpering his concern. The bystanders moved as we hurried up, and then we caught glimpses of towels and water and hastily improvised bandages, and smelt brandy, and saw in the midst of all this Wing, propped up against a bank of earth, his eyes closed, and over his yellow face a queer grey-white pallor. His left arm and shoulder were bare, save for the bandages which Cazalet was applying. There were discarded ones on the turf, which was soaked with blood. Lorrimore darted forward with a hasty exclamation, and had Cazalet's job out of the old gentleman's hands and into his own before the rest of us could speak. He motioned the whole of us away except Cazalet and the woman, and the police inspector turned to Mr. Raven and his niece, and to myself and Scarterfield. "I think we were just about in time," he said laconically. "I don't know what it all means, but I reckon the man was about done for. Bleeding to death, I should say." "You found him?" I asked. "No," he answered. "Not at first, anyway. The woman there says she was out here in her garden, feeding her fowls, when she saw him stagger round the corner of the wood there and make for her. He fell across the bank, where he's lying in a dead faint, and she ran for water. Just then we came along in the trap, saw what was happening and jumped out. Fortunately, when we set off, Mr. Cazalet insisted on bringing a big flask of neat brandy and some food. He said you never knew what you mightn't want, and we gave him a stiff dose and pulled him round sufficiently to be able to tell us where he was wounded. And he's got a skinful. A bullet through the thick part of his left arm, another at the point of the same shoulder, and a third just underneath it. Mr. Cazalet says they're all flesh wounds, but I don't know. I know the man's fainted twice since we got to him. And look here, just before he fainted the last time, he managed to fumble amongst his clothing with his right hand, and he pulled something out and shoved it into my hand with a word or two. 'Give it to Lorrimore,' he said in a very weak voice. 'Tell him I found it all out, and was going to trap all of them, but they were too quick for me last night. All dead now.' Then he fainted again, and look at this." He drew out a piece of canvas, twisted up anyhow, and opening it before our wondering eyes, revealed a heap of magnificent pearls and a couple of wonderful rubies that shone in the sunlight like fire. "That's what he gave me," said the inspector. "What is it? What's it mean?" "That's what Salter Quick was murdered for," said I, "and it means that Lorrimore's man ran down the murderer." And without waiting for any comment from him, and leaving Scarterfield to explain matters, I went across the little garden to see how the honest Chinaman was faring. It was a strange, yet a plain story that Wing told his master and a select few of us a day or two later, when Lorrimore had patched him up. To anybody of a humdrum life, such as mine had always been until these events, it was indeed a stirring story. The queer thing, however, at any rate queer to me, was that the narrator, as calm and suave as ever in his telling of it, did not seem to regard it as anything strange at all. He might have been explaining to us some new way of making a good cake. At our request and suggestion, he had journeyed to London and plunged into those quarters of the East End wherein his fellow countrymen are to be found. His knowledge of the district of which Limehouse Causeway forms the centre soon brought him in touch with Lo Chuh Fen, who, as he quickly discovered, had remained in London during the last 2 or 3 years, assisting in the management of a Chinese eating-house. Close by, in a lodging kept by a compatriot, Wing put himself up and cultivated Chuh's acquaintance. Ere many days had passed, another Chinaman came on the scene. This was the man whom Baxter had described as a Chinese gentleman. He represented himself to Wing and Chuh as a countryman of theirs, who had been engaged in highly successful trading operations in Europe, and was now, in company with 2 friends, an Englishman and a Frenchman, carrying out another which involved a trip in a small but well-appointed yacht across the Atlantic. He wanted these countrymen of his own to make up a crew. An introduction to Baxter and the Frenchman followed, and Wing and Chuh were taken into confidence as regards the treasure hidden on the Northumberland coast. A share of the proceeds was promised them. They secured a third trustworthy Chinaman, in the person of one Ah Wong, an associate of Chuh's, and the yawl, duly equipped, left the Thames and went northward. By this time Wing had wormed himself completely into Chuh's confidence, and without even discovering whether Chuh was or was not the actual murderer of Salter Quick. He believed him to be, and believed Wong to be the murderer of Noah at Saltash. He had found out that Chuh was in possession of the pearls and rubies which, though Wing had no knowledge of that, Salter had exhibited to Baubenheimer. And as the yawl neared the scene of the next operations, Wing made his own plans. He had found out that its owners, after recovering the monastic treasurers, were going to call at Leith, where they were to be met by the private yacht of some American whose name Wing never heard. Accordingly, he made up his mind to escape from the yawl as soon as it got into Leith, to go straight to the police, and there give information as to the doings of the men he was with. But here his plans were frustrated. He was taken aback by the capture of Miss Raven and myself by Baxter and the Frenchman, and though he contrived to keep out of our way, he was greatly concerned lest we should see him and conclude that he had joined the gang and was privy to its past and present doings. But that very night a much more serious development materialized. The Chinese gentleman, arriving from London and being met by the Frenchman at Berwick, had a scheme of his own, which, after he had attempted the drugging of his 2 principal associates, he unfolded to his fellow countrymen. This was to get rid of Baxter and the Frenchman and seize the yawl and its contents for themselves, sailing with it to some port in North Russia. Wing had no option but to profess agreement. His only proviso was that Miss Raven and myself should be cleared out of the yawl. This proposition was readily assented to, and Chuh was charged with the job of sending us ashore. But almost immediately afterwards everything went wrong with the conspirators' plans. The drug which had been administered to Baxter and the Frenchman failed to act. Baxter, waking suddenly to find the Chinaman advancing on the cabin with only 2 evident murderous intent, opened fire on them, and the situation rapidly resolved itself into a free fight, in the course of which Wing barricaded himself into the galley. Before long he saw that of all the men on board only himself and Baxter remained alive. He saw, too, that Baxter was already wounded. Baxter, evidently afraid of Wing, also barricaded himself into the cabin. For some hours the 2 secretly awaited each other's onslaught. At last Wing determined to make a bid for liberty, and cautiously worming his way to the cabin, he looked in and, as he thought, saw Baxter lying either dead or dying. He then hastily stripped Chuh of the belt in which he knew him to carry the precious stones, and taking to the boat which lay at the side of the yawl, pushed off, only to find Baxter after him with a revolver. In the exchange of shots which followed, Wing was hit twice, but a lucky reply of his laid Baxter dead. At that he got away, weak and fainting, managed to make the shore, to bind up as much of his wounded body as he could get at, and set out as well as he was able for his master's house. The rest we knew. So that was all over, and it only remained now for the police to clear things up, for Wing to be thoroughly whitewashed in the matter of the shooting of Netherfield Baxter, and for everybody in the countryside to talk of the affair for 9 days, and perhaps a little more. Mr. Cazalet talked a great deal. As for Miss Raven and myself, as actors in the last act of the drama which ended in such a tragedy, we talked little. We had seen too much at close quarters. But on the first occasion on which she and I were alone again, I made a confession to her. "I don't want you, of all people, to get any mistaken impression about me," I said. "So I'm going to tell you something. During the whole of the time that you and I were on that yawl, I was in an absolute panic of fear." "You were?" she exclaimed. "Really frightened?" "Quaking with fright," I declared boldly. "Especially after you'd retired. I literally sweated with fear. There, now it's out." She looked at me not at all unkindly. She said at last. "Then all I have to say is that you concealed it admirably, when I was about at any rate. And," here she sunk her voice to a pleasing whisper, "I'm sure that if you were frightened, it was entirely on my account. So?" In that way we began a courtship which, proving highly satisfactory on both sides, is now about to come to an end, or a new beginning, in marriage. End of chapter 25. Recording by Nicholas Clifford, Middlebury, Vermont, USA. End of Ravensdene Court by J.S. Fletcher.